The Qur'an, Dajjal and the Jasad by Imran Hosein. Chapter 4. How does Dajjal reduce human beings into Jasads like himself? No Muslim in the modern age has demonstrated greater insight into the Jasad than Malcolm X. Almost 60 years have passed since Malcolm stunned the world with his brilliant description of the house slave and how he differs from the field slave. In fact, Malcolm's house slave or house Negro is a Jasad, since he is both externally as well as internally a slave. Perhaps the first and most prevalent way through which Dajjal achieves his objective of transforming human beings into Jasads like himself is through tempting people into committing sins which result in the loss of internal nur or light. Such would be sins such as riba, which is lending or borrowing money on interest, or taking people's property from them by deception. Such also would be the sin of zina, which is sexual intercourse with someone with whom one is not lawfully permitted to do so, i.e., someone who is not a wife of marriage or a milk al-yamin. But his most formidable weapon is at work when he convinces a believer to choose the hayat al-dunya, i.e., the life of this world, over the akhirah, i.e., the hereafter. The Qur'an has delivered a stern warning to such people who prefer the life of this world to the hereafter and are hence reduced to becoming kafir. Dajjal has the word kafir or disbeliever written between his eyes on his forehead, and hence he poses the supreme danger to faith of believers. الذين يستحبون الحياة الدنيا على الآخرة ويصدون عن سبيل الله ويبغونها عوجا أولئك في ضلال بعيد. They, i.e. the kuffar, are those who love the life of this world more than the hereafter, who hinder men from the path of Allah and seek therein something crooked. They are astray by a long distance. Surah Ibrahim, chapter 14, verse 3. But Dajjal also achieves this objective through a sustained process of brainwashing. And as a result, people no longer think for themselves, nor do they make their own independent choices in life. Rather, Dajjal so brainwashes them that he thinks for them, and he makes their choices for them. As Dajjal succeeds in this mission of his, a global society eventually emerges in which those amongst mankind who are so brainwashed would live the same, essentially godless way of life, bereft of the understanding of the reality of the world in which they live. They will then dance to every tune that Dajjal plays, and whoever refuses to dance would be attacked and punished the Venezuelan way. Those readers who still have the capacity to think would recognize that Dajjal has largely accomplished that mission. Others who have lost the capacity to think, or who have abandoned thinking because it interferes with the enjoyment of the life of this world, would be bewildered to know that Dajjal is the mastermind who has created today's global society. In the same way that Dajjal has been deceiving the shayateen, plural of Satan, of the jinn into carrying out his plans, so too has he already deceived large numbers of people who were tested and failed the tests. The classic example is the current bogus jihad in Syria, the shirk of the modern state, and riba of the monetary system. Both jinn and human beings have the capacity to think, rather than to act blindly in such a way as to serve Dajjal. Both jinn and human beings would hence be held responsible before Allah Most High on Judgment Day if they allowed Dajjal to deceive them into following him instead of the truth which has come from Allah Most High. What awaits mankind in the not too distant future is even worse, as millions of children grow up to become adults with no capacity to think, because their thinking process has been damaged by smartphones, wireless internet, etc. وَلَقَدْ ذَرَأْنَا لِجَهَنَّمَ كَثِيرًا مِنَ الْجِنِّ وَالْإِنسِ لَهُمْ قُلُوبٌ لَا يَفْقَهُونَ بِهَا وَلَهُمْ أَعْيُنٌ لَا يُبْصِرُونَ بِهَا وَلَهُمْ آذَانٌ لَا يَسْمَعُونَ بِهَا أُولَئِكَ كَالْأَنْعَامِ بَلْ هُمْ أَضَلُّ أُولَئِكَ هُمُ الْغَافِلُونَ. And certainly have we destined, i.e. ordained a destiny, for hell, many of the jinn and men who have hearts with which they fail to grasp the truth, and eyes with which they fail to see, and ears with which they fail to hear. They are like cattle, nay, they are even less conscious of the right way. It is they who are truly heedless. Malcolm X and the Jasad. No Muslim in the modern age has demonstrated greater insight into the Jasad than Malcolm X. Almost 60 years have passed since Malcolm stunned the world with his brilliant description of the house slave and how he differs from the field slave. In fact, Malcolm's house slave or house Negro is a Jasad, since he is both externally as well as internally a slave. So you have two types of Negro, the old type and the new type. Most of you know the old type. When you read about him in history during slavery, he was called Uncle Tom. He was the house Negro, and during slavery, you had two Negroes. You had the house Negro and the field Negro. The house Negro usually lived close to his master. He dressed like his master. He wore his master's second-hand clothes. He ate food that his master left on the table, and he lived in his master's house, probably in the basement or the attic, but he still lived in the master's house. So whenever that house Negro identified himself, he always identified himself in the same sense that his master identified himself. When his master said, "We have good food," the house Negro would say, "Yes, we have plenty of good food." When the master said that, "We have a fine home here," the house Negro said, "Yes, we have a fine home here." When the master would be sick, the house Negro identified himself so much with his master, he'd say, "What's the matter, boss? We sick." His master's pain was his pain, and it hurt him more for his master to be sick than for him to be sick himself. When the house started burning down, that type of Negro would fight harder to put the master's house out than the master himself would. But then you had another Negro out in the field. The house Negro was in the minority. The masses, the field Negroes were the masses. They were in the majority. When the master got sick, they prayed that he'd die. If his house caught on fire, they'd pray for a wind to come along and fan the breeze. If someone came to the house Negro and said, "Let's go, let's separate," naturally, that Uncle Tom would say, "Go where? What could I do without boss? Where would I live? How would I dress? Who would look out for me?" That's the house Negro. But if you went to the field Negro and said, "Let's go, let's separate," he wouldn't even ask you where or how. He'd say, "Yes, let's go." And that one ended right there. So now you have a 20th century type of house Negro, a 20th century Uncle Tom. He's just as much an Uncle Tom today as Uncle Tom was 100 and 200 years ago. Only he's a modern Uncle Tom. That Uncle Tom wore a handkerchief around his head. This Uncle Tom wears a top hat. He's sharp. He dresses just like you do. He speaks the same phraseology, the same language. He tries to speak it better than you do. He speaks with the same accents, same diction. And when you say your army, he says our army. He hasn't got anybody to defend him. But anytime you say we, he says we. Our president, our government, our Senate, our congressman, our this and our that. And he hasn't even got a seat in that our, even at the end of the line. So this is the 20th century Negro. Whenever you say you, the personal pronoun in the singular or in the plural, he uses it right along with you. When you say you're in trouble, he says, "Yes, we're in trouble." But there's another kind of black man on the scene. If you say you're in trouble, he says, "Yes, you're in trouble." He doesn't identify himself with your plight whatsoever. Source: Malcolm X, The Race Problem, African Students Association and NAACP, Michigan State University, Michigan, 23rd of January, 1963. The house slave, as described by Malcolm, fits perfectly the description of a human being who has been reduced by Dajjal to a Jasad. Jasads have proliferated in North America to such an extent these last 60 years that if Malcolm were alive today, he would be banned from lecturing in most of the masajid, and he would never be invited to speak in any of the mega conventions of Muslims in USA or Canada, where 15,000 or more gather to be brainwashed with a cosmetic brand of Islam, of which the slave master approves. Chapter 5. The Jasad, the Jinn, and the death of Solomon alayhi salam. It appears to be an almost universally held view that Solomon alayhi salam died while sitting, perhaps on his throne, and that it was his dead physical body which eventually collapsed after some earthworms had spent what must have been an endless amount of time gnawing away at the bottom of his staff. Our view is that it was the Jasad who was sitting on the throne ever since Solomon died, and that he was using the minsa'a of his staff for backward and forward travel in time in order to present to the jinn live images of Solomon. However, when Dabbat Al-Ard consumed the minsa'a of Solomon's staff, the Jasad lost the capacity to present to the jinn those live images of Solomon which showed him sitting on his throne and moving about. It was those images of Solomon which collapsed and disappeared when that minsa'a of the staff was consumed, and not Solomon's physical body. And only then did the jinn realize that the person sitting on the throne all this while was not Solomon, but rather someone else. We now turn once more to the Jasad who was shown sitting on Solomon's throne. This time, however, the Qur'an directs us to the occasion of Solomon's death, alayhi salam. Allah Most High had ordered the jinn to work for Solomon alayhi salam and had warned them of severe punishment if they ever disobeyed him. وَمِنَ الْجِنِّ مَنْ يَعْمَلُ بَيْنَ يَدَيْهِ بِإِذْنِ رَبِّهِ وَمَنْ يَزِغْ مِنْهُمْ عَنْ أَمْرِنَا نُذِقْهُ مِنْ عَذَابِ السَّعِيرِ. And among the jinn, there were some that had been ordered to work for Solomon by Allah's leave, and whichever of them deviated from our command, him would we let taste suffering through a blazing fire. Surah Saba, chapter 34, verse 12. The Qur'an identified those jinn as shayateen, or satanic jinn, and went on to inform us of other jinn who served Solomon alayhi salam while shackled in chains. وَالشَّيَاطِينَ كُلَّ بَنَّاءٍ وَغَوَّاسٍ وَآخَرِينَ مُقَرَّنِينَ فِي الْأَصْفَادِ. And among the jinn who were ordered to work for Solomon were multitude of shayateen who worked as builders and divers, and others linked together in fetters. Surah Sad, chapter 38, verses 37 to 38. We now turn to that moment in time when Solomon alayhi salam died, and the jinn were unaware that he was dead. Hence, they kept on working until Dabbat Al-Ard, or a creature of the earth, came along to so consume the minsa'a of Solomon's staff that live images of Solomon collapsed. Only then did the jinn realize that Solomon was dead, and that had they known it, they would have not kept on working for so long in vain. There are many commentators of the Qur'an who explain that it was Solomon's dead body which collapsed. Hence they offer an explanation of the verse to the effect that Solomon died while sitting on his throne and holding onto his staff. Some commentators locate his death to have occurred elsewhere than while sitting on his throne. فَلَمَّا قَضَيْنَا عَلَيْهِ الْمَوْتَ مَا دَلَّهُمْ عَلَى مَوْتِهِ إِلَّا دَابَّةُ الْأَرْضِ تَأْكُلُ مِنْ سَأَتَهِ فَلَمَّا خَرَّ تَبَيَّنَتِ الْجِنُّ أَنْ لَوْ كَانُوا يَعْلَمُونَ الْغَيْبَ مَا لَبِثُوا فِي الْعَذَابِ الْمُهِينِ. Surah Saba, chapter 34, verse 14. There are many today who cannot access the Qur'an other than through a translation, and this is what they learn from some English translations. Muhammad Asad's translation of the above verse. Yet even Solomon had to die, but when we decreed that he should die, nothing showed them that he was dead except an earthworm that gnawed away his staff. And when he fell to the ground, those invisible beings subservient to him saw clearly that, had they but understood the reality which was beyond the reach of their perception, they would not have continued to toil in the shameful suffering of servitude. Here is his commentary of the verse. This is yet another of the many Solomonic legends which has become an inalienable part of ancient Arabian tradition, and which the Qur'an uses as a vehicle for the allegorical illustration of some of its teachings. According to the legend alluded to above, Solomon died on his throne, leaning forward on his staff, and for a length of time, nobody became aware of his death, with the result that the jinn who had been constrained to work for him went on laboring at the heavy tasks assigned to them. Gradually, however, a termite ate away Solomon's staff, and his body, deprived of support, fell to the ground. This story, only hinted at in its outline, is apparently used here as an allegory of the insignificance and inherent brittleness of human life, and of the perishable nature and emptiness of all worldly might and glory. Surah Saba, chapter 34, verse 14. It is incredible that Asad should declare of a passage of the Qur'an that it has no factual reality, but rather that it is a legend that Allah Most High chose to use in order to teach a lesson. Asad had to adopt this quite improper view, since he clearly dismissed the possibility that Solomon alayhi salam could have been dead for a long period of time without the jinn knowing about it, and that it was only when the earthworms had gnawed sufficiently at the bottom of the staff that it lost its balance and collapsed, that Solomon's body also collapsed. What Asad did not know was that Allah Most High did not resort to any recycled legend, and it was his incapacity to understand the Qur'an that led him to make that false comment concerning Allah Most High. Abdullah Yusuf Ali renders the verse as follows: Then, when we decreed Solomon's death, nothing showed them his death except a little worm of the earth, which kept slowly gnawing away at his staff. So when he fell down, the jinn saw plainly that if they had known the unseen, they would not have tarried in the humiliating penalty of their task. Here is his commentary. This allegory illustrates 3 points. 1. However great and glorious human power and grandeur may be, it is only for a time, and it may fade away even before people know of its decline. 2. The most remarkable events may be brought to light, not by a flourish of trumpets, but by a humble individual, unknown and unseen, who works imperceptibly and undermines even so strong a thing as a staff on which a great man may lean. 3. Work done by men merely on the basis of brute strength or fear, as in the case of the jinns, will not endure. This is brought up in strong contrast against the power and majesty of Allah, which will endure, which cannot be sapped, and which can only be fully appreciated by a training of the will and heart. In the same way, in David's story above, his mighty strength as a warrior, see chapter 2, verse 251, and his skill in making armor, are only to be valued when used, as it was used, in the service of Allah, in righteous works, chapter 34, verse 11. The jinns looked upon their work as a penalty, and so it became to them. The people who worked at the temple of Solomon, as the people of David, worked and gloried in their work as a thanksgiving to Allah, and their work became sanctified. The jinns knew nothing of hidden secrets, they only saw the obvious, and had not even seen the significance of the little worm that slowly gnawed away Solomon's staff. Marmaduke Pickthall had this translation: and when we decreed death for him, nothing showed his death to them, save a creeping creature of the earth, which gnawed away his staff. And when he fell, the jinn saw clearly how if they had known the unseen, they would not have continued in despised toil. Elementary common sense is enough for us to realize that if a king of a ruling state in the world were to have died in private space, his family members and servants would quickly discover his death. If, on the other hand, he died in public space, such as while sitting on his throne, it would not take as long as an hour before his death was discovered. It is impossible that he could have remained dead on his throne or anywhere else for even an entire day with no one realizing that he was dead. A king who is sitting on his throne in a public hall would not only be in the presence of his court, but would also have security staff that would be constantly monitoring him to assure his safety. Such security staff would recognize within minutes that something had happened to him and would investigate. A king in private space would have family members who would approach him, and so too his servants and other staff. A king cannot remain for endless hours without being served with a meal. Hence, it would be impossible that his death would not soon be discovered. It appears to be an almost universally held view that Solomon alayhi salam died while sitting, perhaps on his throne, and that it was his dead physical body which eventually collapsed after some earthworms had spent what must have been an endless amount of time gnawing away at the bottom of his staff. Our view is that it was the Jasad who was sitting on the throne ever since Solomon died, and that he was using the minsa'a of his staff for backward and forward travel in time in order to present to the jinn live images of Solomon. However, when Dabbat Al-Ard consumed the minsa'a of Solomon's staff, the Jasad lost the capacity to present to the jinn those live images of Solomon which showed him sitting on his throne and moving about. It was those images of Solomon which collapsed and disappeared when that minsa'a of the staff was consumed, and not Solomon's physical body, and only then did the jinn realize that the person sitting on the throne all this while was not Solomon, but rather was someone else. Who then was sitting on Solomon's throne all this while since he died, and who deceived the jinn to work for him while they believed that they were working for Solomon alayhi salam? Our answer is that Dajjal, the Jasad, was sitting on the throne. Indeed, he is still sitting on the throne even as this book is being written. We therefore recognize that Dajjal would continue to deceive the jinn until Dabbat Al-Ard, or a creature of the earth, so consumes Solomon's staff that it destroys its minsa'a, or miraculous capacity, which made it possible for the Jasad to present to the jinn live images of a Solomon alayhi salam. Dajjal is therefore profiting up to this day from evil work being done for him by the shayateen of the jinn, and this partially explains Jerusalem's ascendancy to center stage in the world as this book is being written. Chapter 6, explaining Dabbat Al-Ard, i.e. a beast or creature of the earth. The verse of the Qur'an concerning Dabbat Al-Ard, i.e. Surah Saba, chapter 34 verse 14, has been almost universally understood to mean that living creatures akin to termites ate away at the base of a standing staff, which then eventually lost its balance and collapsed. We are both unimpressed and unconvinced by that explanation. Allah Most Wise created those who would incrementally chip away at the power and authority of Dajjal's Israel. The chippers chip away at something located within Solomon's staff, i.e. minsa'a, until the staff loses its divinely bestowed constitution, i.e. fitra, which allows it to be used to present such live images of Solomon as would convince the jinn that he was still alive and sitting on his throne. When the staff loses that miraculous fitra, the live images of Solomon, who was long dead, would collapse, and it would only be when it collapses that Dajjal, the Jasad, would lose his ability to convince the jinn that it was Solomon alayhi salam who was sitting on the throne. At that moment, when this fact dawns upon the jinn, Dajjal's unholy state of Israel will lose the centuries-long support of the jinn, with consequences that must terrify every Zionist Jew and Zionist Christian supporter of that Israel. Here is the verse of the Qur'an which has delivered this extraordinary information. فَلَمَّا قَضَيْنَا عَلَيْهِ الْمَوْتِ مَا دَلَّهُمْ عَلَى مَوْتِهِ إِلَّا دَابَّةُ الْأَرْضِ تَأْكُلُ مِنْ سَأَتَهُ فلما خر تبينت الجن أن لو كانوا يعلمون الغيب ما لبثوا في العذاب المهين. When Allah Most High decreed that Solomon alayhi salam should die, the jinn never realized that he was dead and that there was a Jasad sitting on his throne in possession of his staff, and so they continued, absent-mindedly so, to obey and to serve the Jasad until Dabbat Al-Ard consumed the minsa'ah of the staff. When the minsa'ah of the staff collapsed, in the sense that it lost its miraculous powers in the world of time, the jinn then perceived the reality before them, i.e., that Solomon was dead and that there was someone else sitting on his throne. The jinn then understood that they would not have continued toiling for so long in the shameful suffering of servitude to an impostor, doing all the evil things the impostor decreed that they must do on Israel's behalf, had they used their capacity to think and to thus penetrate beyond the appearance to reach the reality, i.e., that they were being taken for a ride. Surah Saba, chapter 34, verse 14. The above verse of the Qur'an, Surah Saba, chapter 34, verse 14, concerning Dabbat Al-Ard, has been almost universally understood to mean that living creatures akin to termites ate away at the base of a standing staff, which then eventually lost its balance and collapsed. We are both unimpressed and unconvinced by that explanation. Proper methodology requires that the Qur'an itself be used to explain the meaning of the word minsa'ah. We must begin the application of proper methodology by recognizing that the Qur'an has always used another word for staff, i.e., asa. In fact, the Qur'an has used the word asa for staff 12 times as follows. Surah Al-A'raf, chapter 7, verses 107, 117, and 160. Surah Taha, chapter 20, verses 18 and 66. Surah Al-Shu'ara, chapter 26, verses 32, 44, 45, 63. Surah Al-Naml, chapter 27, verses 10, and Surah Al-Qasas, chapter 28, verse 31. Why then should Allah Most High depart from a word asa, which He has consistently used to mean staff, and in this solitary instance use another word, minsa'ah, to mean the same thing? This cannot have occurred by accident. There must be a reason for this departure from the word asa and solitary instance of the word minsa'ah instead. Allah Most High sent the Qur'an to people who think, and here is an instance where we are provoked to think in order to understand why a new word, i.e. minsa'ah, is used instead of the other word for staff, i.e. asa, which is used throughout the Qur'an. When we proceed to apply proper methodology in searching the Qur'an for any other instance in which the minsa'ah occurs, we find one solitary instance in Surah At-Tawbah as follows. إنما النسيء زيادة في الكفر يضل به الذين كفروا يحلونه عاما ويحرمونه عاما ليواطئوا عدة ما حرم الله فيحلوا ما حرم الله زين لهم سوء أعمالهم والله لا يهدي القوم الكافرين. Allah Most High has denounced in the above verse the Arab practice of interfering with time and has declared such to be one more instance of their refusal to acknowledge the truth, a means by which those who are bent on denying the truth are led astray. They declare this practice of adding an extra month every third year in order that the lunar year may synchronize with the solar year to be permissible in one year and forbidden in another year in order to conform outwardly to the number of months which Allah has hallowed, and thus they make permissible what Allah has prohibited. Goodly seems unto them the evil of their own doings, since Allah does not grace with His guidance people who refuse to acknowledge the truth. Surah At-Tawbah, chapter 9, verse 37. The above verse of the blessed Qur'an has very clearly used the word an-nasi'u to mean time. In this case, it is the change in the system of measurement of the passage of time in which Allah Most High has ordained that a year should comprise of 12 lunar months. When the Prophet ﷺ used the same word, he also used it for time in the sense of prolongation of lifespan. عن أنس بن مالك رضي الله عنه قال: سمعت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يقول: من سره أن يبسط له في رزقه أو ينسأ له في أثره فليصل رحمه. Whoever wishes that he be granted more wealth and that his lease of life be prolonged, he should keep good relations with his kith and kin. Bukhari and Muslim. Some commentators of the Qur'an are of the view that the word minsa'ah above means staff or walking stick. We believe that this explanation of the word minsa'ah is inadequate. If we accept this explanation of the meaning of the word minsa'ah, then the implication would be that Solomon alayhi salam was holding onto his staff, and when the staff collapsed, his dead body also collapsed. Our view of minsa'ah. It is clear to us that it was because of his possession of Solomon's staff that the Jasad, who was sitting on Solomon's throne, could succeed in having the jinn continue to work for him. Solomon's staff had to possess certain divinely bestowed miraculous powers or properties related to the world of time to have that effect on the jinn. We can recall to advantage that it was with his staff, which also possessed similar divinely bestowed power and properties, that Moses, i.e. Nabi Musa alayhi salam, struck the Red Sea, which then parted miraculously to make a track of dry land through which the Israelites could pass to safety. See Qur'an, Surah Ash-Shura, chapter 26, verse 23. It was also with his staff that Moses struck the rock, and 12 streams of water then flowed miraculously from the rock, one stream for each of Israel's 12 tribes. Surah Al-Baqarah, chapter 2, verse 160. It was with that same staff that Moses defeated Pharaoh's magicians when his staff became a serpent which miraculously swallowed all that they produced as magic. Surah Al-A'raf, chapter 7, verses 107 to 117. We may also recall that it was with Yusuf's shirt, which was thrown on his father Ya'qub's face, that his sight was miraculously restored, alayhim as-salam. If minsa'ah refers to the miraculous powers of the staff, which made possible forward and backward movement in time, then this would explain how the Jasad was able to use the staff to deceive the jinn, thus preventing them from realizing that Solomon alayhi salam was dead and that there was someone else sitting on his throne. Our view is that the minsa'ah made it possible for moving images of Solomon alayhi salam alive and sitting on his throne to be presented to the jinn, and thus they were deceived. Dabbat Al-Ard would then have to be something which incrementally dismantles and eventually succeeds in nullifying or destroying the miraculous properties of Solomon's staff, in consequence of which the moving images collapsed when the minsa'ah of the staff was consumed. Our conclusion is that since neither the Qur'an nor the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ support the meaning of minsa'ah, which has been given by some commentators of the Qur'an as just staff, we are now left with only one alternative, i.e. that minsa'ah refers to some miraculous capacity in Solomon's staff which is related to time. Dabbat Al-Ard would then be those who destroy the miraculous capacity of the staff to permit simultaneous travel back and forth through different dimensions of time. It was through this back and forth travel that the young men who were asleep in the cave could remain in 2 dimensions of time simultaneously. Surah Al-Kahf, chapter 18, verses 16 to 20. If the Jasad could manipulate different dimensions of time, he could thereby present to the jinn an image of Solomon, who is still alive, while concealing from them Solomon's death. If Dajjal, the Jasad, can manipulate different dimensions of time through the minsa'ah of Solomon's staff, and hence advance his agenda of eventually ruling the world from Holy Jerusalem, we will have to accept that the major function of Dabbat Al-Ard is to eventually checkmate Dajjal, the Jasad, by depriving him of that miraculous capacity of the staff. They do so by consuming the minsa'ah of the staff, and thereby deprive the staff of its miraculous properties and functions, and Allah knows best. In another verse, the Qur'an further describes Dabbat Al-Ard as something which will either speak to them or injure them. وَإِذَا وَقَعَ الْقَوْلُ عَلَيْهِمْ أَخْرَجْنَا لَهُمْ دَابَّةً مِنَ الْأَرْضِ تُكَلِّمُهُمْ أَنَّ النَّاسَ كَانُوا بِآيَاتِنَا لَا يُوقِنُونَ. Now, as for the deaf and blind of heart, when the word of truth stands revealed against them, we shall bring forth unto them out of the earth a creature which will speak to or injure them, because mankind had no real faith in our messages. Surah An-Naml, chapter 27, verse 82. The emergence of the beast or creature of the earth, i.e. Dabbat Al-Ard, is therefore directly linked to the negligence of a world of people who allow themselves to become brainwashed. The same Arabic word, tukallimuhum, can have two different meanings based on different punctuation. If it is written as tukallimuhum, then it would mean speak to them. But if it is written as taklimuhum, it would mean wound them. Both meanings would appear to apply if we interpret Dabbat Al-Ard in the manner which we have just done. The learned companion of the Blessed Prophet ﷺ, Abdullah ibn Abbas, held this view. Our view is to identify Dabbat Al-Ard with the invisible electronic waves emitted from television screens, cellular smartphones, and wireless internet, etc., and Allah knows best. Already, bees have difficulty in navigating their way to and from the pollen in flowers, and as a consequence, the production of honey in the mysterious modern world is in constant and alarming decline. In addition, electronic communication through so-called smartphones and other such cellular phones is rapidly transforming much of the thus connected world into a virtual talk city in which the cattle of the world spend endless hours, days, weeks, and eventually a lifetime communicating with each other in what may best be described as a talk city. Eventually, the cattle become so addicted to what is sometimes known as blah blah that they cannot bear to live without those devices. They remain unaware that this explosion in talk is not happening by accident. Rather, a divine plan is unfolding in which the electronic waves emitted into the atmosphere and into the human eardrum and brain will not only cause the miraculous properties of Solomon's staff to be consumed electronically, but will also damage people's brains to such an extent that brain cancer, dementia, and a form of dementia known as Alzheimer's would become commonplace. Indeed, there may be an epidemic in the making. Alzheimer's is a brain disease that causes a slow decline in memory, thinking and reasoning. وَلَا تَكُونُوا كَالَّذِينَ نَسُوا اللَّهَ فَأَنْسَاهُمْ أَنفُسَهُمْ أُولَئِكَ هُمُ الْفَاسِقُونَ. Allah warns mankind not to be like those who are oblivious of Allah and whom He therefore causes to become oblivious of their own status as human beings, for it is they who are truly depraved. Surah Al-Hashr, chapter 59, verse 19. Those who are not comfortable with the above identification of Dabbat Al-Ard may choose instead to await a Dabbat Al-Ard described elsewhere as follows. Its head is like the head of a bull. Its eyes are like the eyes of a pig. Its ears are like the ears of an elephant. Its horns are like the horns of a stag. Its neck is like the neck of an ostrich. Its chest is like the chest of a lion. Its color is like the color of a tiger. Its haunches are like the haunches of a cat. Its tail is like the tail of a ram, and its legs are like the legs of a camel. This function of Dabbat Al-Ard must be very convenient for Dajjal, who has precisely the same goal of incrementally dismantling every rival to Israel that now exists in the world. Hence the explanation for the fate which is now embracing such great states of the modern West as the USA, UK, France, Germany, etc. These ruling states and their greatest allies, which gave to the world the likes of Pax Britannica and Pax Americana, are being incrementally dismantled by hidden forces akin to termites which are constantly nibbling away at the staff that maintains the balance of a soulless body sitting on the throne reserved for the ruling state. The rivals to Israel's status as ruling state in the world will one day collapse. It is just a matter of time. This writer pauses to advise all those who have faith in the one God, Muslim, Christian, Jew or otherwise, and who are living within the embrace of Dajjal's electronically connected world, to seek protection and healing through continuous recitation of the Arabic text of the blessed Qur'an. This is particularly important for those who continuously use, foolishly so, their so-called smartphones and other cellular phones. This writer pauses to remind such people of the divine declaration that the Qur'an can heal. وَنُنَزِّلُ مِنَ الْقُرْآنِ مَا هُوَ شِفَاءٌ وَرَحْمَةٌ لِلْمُؤْمِنِينَ وَلَا يَزِيدُ الظَّالِمِينَ إِلَّا خَسَارًا. Thus, step by step, Allah Most High bestowed through this Qur'an that which heals, and is a grace unto those who believe in the one God, the while it only adds to the ruin of evildoers. Surah Al-Isra, chapter 17, verse 82. The scientific and medical evidence should soon emerge that electromagnetic radiation emitted from laptop computers, cell phones, and other electronic devices are harmful to our bodies. Not only will we soon have evidence of a link with brain tumors, infertility, etc., but most frighteningly of all is the damage done to the memory and thus to the capacity to think. The world may soon be filled with Jasads. This writer anticipates a time which will not be long in coming, when no child who is brought up exposed to electromagnetic radiation in the electronically wired cities and towns of the modern world would be able to memorize the Qur'an because of damage to his memory. We conclude our advice to parents who reside in towns and cities of the modern world to ensure that their children recite the Qur'an daily and complete the recitation of the Qur'an at least once a month, in order that the Qur'an might function as a shield protecting the brain and mind of the child from damage caused by such radiation. We may also point out before ending this brief book that when we prostrate our salah in the position of sajda, we make 7 points of contact with the earth with 7 bones of the body. The most important of all is when the bone which connects the forehead with the nose touches the ground. While each bone functions as a conduit for electromagnetic radiation to be transferred from our bodies to the earth, thus saving the body from their harmful effects, the transfer from the brain and head is the most important of all, since it is the head that the greatest danger exists from such radiation. Finally, we should avoid the use of shoes with rubber soles, since rubber prevents the transfer of the radiation through the feet to the earth. Last word. This book is written with the specific purpose of inviting, respectfully so, a scholarly response to our views expressed on the subjects of the Jasad as well as Dabbat Al-Ard, from those who defend the Salafi methodology as well as from those who defend the method by which the Qur'an is taught and studied in the Darul Ulum. We await their response.